Do 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 do. Okay, goodbye. Take her away, please. Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm talking about the strict hierarchy of the English country house. We're mainly talking about the late Victorian into the Edwardian era. There are a few names for these type of houses: the English country house, a manor house, a great house, or they were called stately homes. Now these were generally the homes of the aristocratic class of England. They were the landed gentry because they were the ruling class and they owned the land. Sometimes these homes were their second home. They had a home in town and this was their country residence, but oftentimes the country home was actually the family's main residence. These estates had a large number of indoor and outdoor staff. The staff kept the house and grounds running and were an important form of employment for the local community. Everybody had a set social position that dictated their behaviour. For the family upstairs, it dictated who could initiate conversations with whom and where they were allowed to sit around the dinner table. And for the domestic staff downstairs, there was an extremely strict pecking order. They were there to serve the family and the positions dictated their wage, where they were allowed to go in the house and who they reported to. In the 20th century, a lot of these larger homes became very difficult to run, especially after the First World War. This was largely due to increased financial costs, with less agricultural demand, higher taxes, and a shortage of staff. The result of this was that a lot of these houses were actually demolished after World War II, right up until the 1970s, when people began to appreciate these houses a bit more and not demolish them. Now these large homes were depicted in lots of period dramas like Upstairs Downstairs, Gosford Park, and of course our favourite, Downton Abbey. The television series is set in a fictional house in Yorkshire and it follows the aristocratic Crawley family and their domestic servants downstairs. The series starts in 1912 with the sinking of the Titanic and follows with the family right through to the 1920s, where the fate of the country house was on rocky ground, which becomes a storyline in later episodes. The show was a massive commercial success and audience felt a certain sense of escapism watching it, but it's important to remember that the series was highly dramatised and at times characters clearly break social conventions of the time. God almighty! Nonetheless, it's a very entertaining look at the English country house, and at the end of the day, it is entertainment. It's not meant to be a factual historical documentary. If you're familiar with Downton Abbey, I'll be using some of the characters later in this video to illustrate the hierarchy within the home. Another great television show that I just have to mention is the Edwardian Country House, or Manor House as it was known in the US on PBS. It is the reality TV version of Downton Abbey, if you will. It aired in 2002 and it follows 19 volunteers as they go back in time to the Edwardian times and live in the house for 3 months, having it running as an Edwardian country home. There were 5 members of the real-life Olive Cooper family who become the aristocratic family living in the home, and 14 people come in to be the servants. Over the course of the show, they completely recreate what it would have been like living in an Edwardian home. They not only dress and use the technology of the time, but they also abide by the strict social rules. A great example of this is the maids. When they're cleaning, if a family member happens to walk into the room that they're cleaning, they have to immediately stand up, go and face a wall and stand like a statue until the family member has left. Some masters of the house really did require this as a rule at the time. And I was actually watching an interview with one of the cast members of Downton Abbey, and they said that they knew about this but couldn't include it in Downton Abbey because it just wouldn't work in a TV drama. The characters have to interact and talk to each other. Not only is the Edwardian country house a bit of an educational look into the Edwardian era, but it's such a fascinating look at dynamics between people. How modern people react when put in a strict pecking order. The downstairs staff form strong bonds between each other and really end up despising the family. And the family upstairs, well, they become pretty up themselves. They get a bit wrapped up in the whole thing, but they also pick and choose when the Edwardian rules are going to apply to them. which really aggravates the downstairs staff. An example of the family picking and choosing when the rules are going to apply to them is when the chef works really hard to make an authentic Edwardian meal. It's literally a pig head that he's roasted, and it's really a meal from the time he serves it to the family, and the master, the father, is not having it. He's turning his nose up, he won't eat it, and this aggravates the chef, understandably, because he's downstairs the whole time, living like an Edwardian, and he doesn't get to pick and choose when the rules are going to apply to him and when they don't. I really highly recommend watching Manor House. It's all the best parts of Downton, and it's all the best parts of reality TV. Okay, before I get on to the official outline of the hierarchy, if you're enjoying this video and you want to see more videos like it, please subscribe to my channel. And if you're liking this video, please hit the like button. It really actually does help the video be seen by more people. I don't know how the algorithm and all that sort of thing works, but it really actually does help boost the video, so thank you so much. Let's briefly talk about the upstairs, the families that were living in these homes. As I mentioned before, they were aristocratic families, they were upper class. Every family had different family members, but generally there was a master of the household and there was the lady of the household. In Downton, of course, they're Lord Grantham and Lady Cora. The eldest son would then inherit the estate. Then the ranking order would be the rest of the boys and the girls. Now, during the Edwardian era, etiquette was everything. It would make or break you socially. As an owner of one of these estates, you're expected to throw lavish parties, including shooting parties where people come and it would go over a few days. The children were really the only members who could move freely between upstairs and downstairs. And the older members of the family really rarely went downstairs. Number one, the family upstairs really didn't need to concern themselves with what was happening downstairs. And number two, it was actually considered quite rude and an invasion of the servants' privacy to be barging in on them downstairs. This, of course, is broken a lot in Downton Abbey. I feel like Mary is constantly downstairs, just like constantly down there for the drama. Alright, let's talk about the downstairs domestic servant hierarchy. Now, the number of staff really did depend on the households. Some households were much, much larger, and then some houses were quite small and only needed a few staff members. And not all the positions were filled all year round. Some of these things were seasonal, or if they were having a massive event or party and they needed more people to come in and work. You get the idea. Let's begin with this small little category of the professional staff. The land agent or the house steward. These were very professional roles. They were managerial positions. They really weren't considered as servants. They were highly educated and they were basically responsible for the running of the estate financially and legally. Oftentimes they had a little cottage on the estate somewhere where they lived. Of course, remember Tom Branson did he become officially the land agent? I think that was his land agent was his title in the later seasons of Downton. Now let's go to the senior staff members. The butler, who of course was Mr. Carson in Downton. The butler was the highest ranking servant downstairs, and he oversaw all the rest of the staff members. He was also who the male staff members really reported to. He was also a bit of a bridge between upstairs and downstairs. He would be the one that the master would talk to if he had any concerns or requests, and vice versa if something needed to be requested for the household from the butler. That was sort of the channel of communication. The butler was also responsible for the wine cellar, and he was really the head of dining and entertainment. Next we have the housekeeper, Mrs. Hughes. The housekeeper was mainly responsible for the house and its appearance and its cleanliness. She was the one who the female staff reported to if they had any issues, so all the maids would go to the housekeeper. Next we have the cook or the chef. The much loved Mrs. Patmore is the cook in Downton Abbey. The cook was responsible for preparing the food and the meals for the house. The cook was also responsible for all the kitchen staff. In some houses, there was actually an undercook and they would be responsible for making the food for the other servants while the main cook focused on making the food for the family. Quality of the food was actually really important for a country house as it was a status symbol. They could afford yummy food and they could afford a great chef, and they had to impress the guests when they came to stay. It was also particularly fashionable to have a French chef. So those three members, the butler, the housekeeper, and the cook, are the three main senior roles. Let's go on to the junior roles within the house. So we have the valet and the lady's maid, and they were kind of similar roles. The valet would be the personal servant to the master of the house, and the lady's maid would be the personal servant to the lady of the house. They would assist with dressing them, with mending their clothes, with sourcing anything they needed. They were also a general companion and confidant. These staff members would actually be specifically hired by the master or the lady because it was crucial that they got along. They spent so much time together, whereas normally the butler would hire the rest of the staff within the house. Now, the valet and the lady's maid were sort of a bit alienated at times because they were seen as being so close to the upstairs family. They knew all their secrets, but then they also knew all the secrets from the people downstairs. So there would be this feeling like they were gossiping about them. In smaller houses, the valeting role or the lady's maid role would sort of be combined with either the butler or the housekeeper because they didn't have as many staff members. In Downton Abbey, a good example of a valet would be Mr. Bates. That was so bad. Mr. Bates. He is the valet to Lord Grantham. And then a good example of ladies' maids is of course Anna. She is Lady Mary's lady's maid. And O'Brien is Cora's lady's maid. Next we have the nurse or the nanny. You'll remember the evil one. That evil nanny. She, of course, was responsible for looking after the children, and this role obviously depended on if there were children within the house that needed looking after. An interesting fact is that a lot of these nurses were actually very young. They were young teenagers, about 14 years old. Additional positions in a larger house that assisted the nurse would be a nursemaid. The nursemaid basically did all the dirty work that was involved with the children, like washing their nappies, etc. And also there would be a wet nurse who was the person who breastfed the children. Now here's another weird sort of in-between role, which would be the governess or the tutor. They were sort of caught in between being upstairs and downstairs. They weren't servants, but they also weren't members of the family, and it left them in a tricky grey area that would have ended up being a very lonely existence for them. They would educate both the boys and the girls, and then when the boys would go off to boarding school, they would continue just to educate the girls in the house. Younger children in this time were really seen and not heard. I think they probably saw their parents for a very limited amount of time. The rest of the time they were with the governess or with the tutor. They really weren't around their parents that much. Next we have the footman, and Thomas Barrow, of course, is the footman. I feel like I'm always like, of course it's Thomas. Other footmen from Downton: William, Alfred, Jimmy, Andy. Now, there would be multiple footmen in the house. The first footman would be in charge, and then there would be a second footman, and then if it was a larger house, there'd be a third and a fourth, etc, etc. Now this is really interesting. It was mostly important for the footmen to be tall and handsome. They really didn't actually have to be that skilled. It was mainly based on looks. Their salaries were actually based on how tall they were. The taller you were, the better your salary. A great example of this is in the English country house when the taller of the two boys is chosen to be the first footman and the shorter one has to be the second footman. And it turns out to be not that great of an idea because the boy who's chosen as the first footman he's a bit lazy, to be honest. At one time he gets so hungover that he's found sleeping outside, and this poor second footman, who's so responsible and wants to do the job, isn't chosen as the first one just because he's a bit shorter. It was also really impressive if your footmen looked alike, if they looked like brothers or even twins. And I suppose this was because it was very visually appealing to the eye to have these men lined up who looked very similar. The footmen would open doors, they would lay the table for meals, they would serve the family their meals, and then they would also assist the lady and master when needed. Now on to the housemaids. The maids in Downton are Gwen, and I think after Gwen leaves, Ethel comes along. The housemaids were responsible for cleaning the house. Cleaning, cleaning, cleaning. They would wake up and clean all day, and then they would go to bed and wake up and clean some more. They would be sweeping and shining everything, emptying chamber pots. In some of the bigger houses where there were more maids, they were actually broken up into categories. So they had the chambermaids who would be responsible for only cleaning the bedrooms, and then they would have parlour maids who would clean other rooms, dining rooms, sitting rooms. Next we have the kitchen maid, the long-suffering kitchen maid. She assisted with food preparation and keeping the kitchen clean. Next we have the hall boy, and I don't believe there is a hall boy in Downton. He was normally a young teenager who had aspirations to be a footman later. He was given the worst jobs in the house, cleaning the boots of everybody, not just the family, but the servants as well. He would empty the servants' chamber pots. He would serve the butler his meals. He was basically the servant to the servants. And he was called the hall boy because his bed was actually in the hallway. He didn't have a bedroom. He just slept in the hall, the poor babe. Now the female equivalent of the hall boy was the scullery maid. She basically also did every gross job that nobody else wanted to do. And that really consisted of spending her whole day in the kitchen scouring and scrubbing pots and pans. I think Daisy starts out in Downton as a scullery maid, or maybe she's a kitchen maid when she starts out and then she works her way up. I swear she's a scullery maid when she starts. In the Edwardian country house, hall boy and the scullery maid actually fancy each other, and they have sort of a teenage romance during the course of the show. Young love, And then now I have sort of a third category, which they're technically staff members, but they were a bit removed because they weren't downstairs with everybody, and that is the ground staff. Now there were stable masters and grooms who worked in the stables. They would look after the horses, they would clean the horses, cleaning the stables, etc. But when the horse and carriage started to phase out and the automobile came in, there was need for a chauffeur. And who was Downton's chauffeur? It was Tom Branson in the first season before he gets a bit frisky with Sybil. This was a really necessary position once automobiles came in. Of course, they had to ferry around the family. The car was also a status symbol for the family. There were Richie Poos who could afford one. And the chauffeur was normally also a mechanic. He had the mechanical skills to maintain the car. Next is the gardener. He was responsible for maintaining and caring for the grounds, making them look pristine and beautiful. So when guests would come to the estate, they would be in awe of the beautiful grounds. And lastly, we have the gamekeeper. The gamekeeper was responsible for maintaining the animal population on the estate so that when the master had his lavish shooting weekends, there would be enough pheasants and deer and rabbits to go out and hunt. Okay, well there we go. That is the hierarchy within the English country house. I love English country houses in that Edwardian time. I feel like we all want to escape back to that time. That's why Downton was such a big hit. One day, I shall venture and live in one. I want to know in the comments down below what role you think you would be best suited for in the Edwardian country house. I personally, if I wasn't, of course, lady of the house, I would want to be a lady's maid. I feel like I have the skills that I would be good at that. I have some sewing skills, I can do a bit of hair. I also love a bit of cheeky but harmless gossip. So I feel like I would be really suited to that role. What role do you think you would be best suited for? Leave it down in the comments below. I'd love to hear what it is. Thank you so much for watching today. If you liked the video, press that like button and please subscribe to my channel. I will see you next time. Bye bye.